Well, all I can say is welcome back, students. It's time for the next semester, the spring semester. It's early, I know, December 23rd. But it's YouTube MASTERCLASS, COURSERA at Harvard, USC, and CALARTS mainly. I'm Dr. Sheley. A few things about myself before we get started. I got my PhD at California Institute of the Arts in 2021. There weren't very many people that were ever nominated for a PhD at CalArts. It was kind of a impossible task that somehow came together at the end, and my mentor John Wagner was really instrumental in getting me through that program. Although I would never be able to spend enough time telling you all the things that were required to do that, and it was totally nearly impossible. It was like living through the unlivable event. It's just like you just make it through and you get it. But it's a good PhD to have. I got my Master's of Fine Arts in several places, even at the American Film Institute. I like to say that because they gave it to me after I got PhDs and Masters at other places. And I got my Master's of Fine Arts originally what I was shooting for at CalArts, and I did get one there, and it was really wild adventure. I can't even get into that, but if you're really interested in graduate school, it can seem scary at times, but it really is worth it in the end, because then you get to jump over and teach people things about film and teach people things about media, and then learn things yourself and then apply it to your own media or apply it to your own media studies. And I think there's a real interest in media studies in general all throughout the world, and how images work and how images teach people and how we even perceive image. Like, do we perceive the image, what's there right as it appears, or did we already know it was there and we were waiting for it to take that place? In other words, do we perceive instantly the things around us as they are, or do the things around us appear to us and then we perceive them? Or do we perceive and they appear at the same simultaneous time? And that's kind of something we think about even when we gravitate towards media studies. Now, one thing that we're getting into right now is, we've talked about animation before, but we're going to talk a little bit more about animation because it's, the holidays and people like to watch animated films. They like to see things that are new and interesting that you can do with animated films. Now, it was funny because when I was covering the writer's strike for the Writers Guild of America, which I run their social media for, we were talking about how we wanted to eliminate artificial intelligence from writing scripts and directing movies and editing films and all this. But let me just say that when it comes to CGI and animation and anything with computer graphics and anything, you can add AI technically without altering how you wanted it to be in the first place. Like, you program the AI on the animation or the video game or the cartoon or and the AI can live in that and grow in that and actually be okay. Like in Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King, all the orcs, all the evil orcs were programmed with AI, and they programmed the AI to program the orcs, and you can use it in animation and CGI and cartoons. But when it comes to writing scripts, it doesn't really work because it just keeps repeating information and kind of makes a fractal out of your essay. And you're like, well, I needed that sentence there. So then you're just sitting there putting your essay back together as AI kind of tore it apart. But they haven't really figured that one out. And I don't really like it for writing. But in this, they use that. But it's kind of an old use because it's Animatrix. This is actually the Japanese copy, and it hasn't been opened, if you notice. And it has an extra scene on there that I'd love to see. But I'm keeping this sacred because if you look at the side, it's got the characters from the Japanese version. And although the Animatrix spins off the word anime, which spins from Japanese animation, and there is Japanese animation in this, it has several animators. However, I can't read them on the back because it's also written in Japanese. It's a very rare copy, but what I will say about the Animatrix is when it comes to certain suggestions of the robot holocaust, which happens twice in this. There's 2 robot holocausts. And I often think to myself, well, if all the robots in the world got destroyed twice or will get destroyed twice, can we prevent it? Or is it just like every day at the construction yard when they're building and destroying things, destroying to get it out of the way, building to create new, and it looks like one big robot flesh fair we've got yet again on AI. Now, Artificial Intelligence is a real movie by Steven Spielberg that he picked up from Stanley Kubrick when he died and finished making it. Like he picked up David Lean's Empire of the Sun and finished making it. Well, he finished making AI, Spielberg. And in part of it, there's actually a robot holocaust, but it's like these robots being like ground into fine powder in these like grinders. I mean, they're just throwing robots and blowing up robots, and it's the robot fair, and it's a lot of it's done in CGI and with familiar voices, and they're knocking people over and they're blowing up robots, and it's like, that's the one thing I don't know the ethic for is it ethical to really destroy a robot? Because actually they've been built so they could do some kind of a mechanical function to replace that mechanical function necessity in the real world with an automaton. And it's really not that sinister. I mean, we've programmed them, but if they get their own mind like they do in 2001 Space Odyssey, then they all come back at us, right? The robots come back at us. Well, and this one's so sinister in the Animatrix to say that there was just a big 100% ban on robots and they were all destroyed. And it's the same story, but Animatrix goes on from there because there's more robots after the robot holocaust. I mean, they always come back, right? And I'm getting a message from YouTube creators, but we're going to skip that and go right to this one, which is a champion of films, and we talked about it a little bit. 1938, Gulliver's Travels, the Fleischer Brothers, the first full-length feature sound film in America. And actually, this movie is the first feature-length animated film ever, The Adventures of Prince Ahmad. And we do love that film, and we do know it was all animated on a pinboard by Lottie Reiniger. She was kind of using the studios at UFA. They made magical Thief of Baghdad looks, all the Thief of Baghdad's, from Michael Powell's to Roald Walsh's to Pasolini's take from Adventures of Prince Ahmad for their Thief of Baghdad, for their Arabian Nights. And we do love the Aladdin sequence. We love the witches' battle in Prince Ahmad. And then we come to the Fleischer Brothers, and one thing about the Fleischer Brothers that's similar to Prince Ahmad is there's all these different characters with all these like leitmotifs. And I know in the movie it's image leitmotifs, but there's also music to Prince Ahmad too that was originally scored not only for the film but for the silent film in general. And Gulliver's Travels has its own soundtrack. I mean, one thing we've got to remember about Gulliver's Travels is the giant who gets put to sleep and tied up by the Lilliputians, the little guys, who are one of the armies that's in battle with another army of small people, and in comparison to Gulliver, who's from the world, and he's huge, and see, these guys are all from like Fantasyland, and they tie him up and everything, but he looks so much like a human because he's rotoscoped, and they made him look giant next to these guys who they hand drew. And that they use cell animation on this is interesting and something we need to take into account. Because when you're looking at all these movies, even with the pinboard and the cardboard cutouts and Prince Ahmad, and then we go back and look at the computer, how it builds animation for the Animatrix. But in an animated film, it takes about half a day to get half a second of animation. So it takes a full day to get a second of animation. Now, I can't really do the math on that, but 60 days for half a minute a piece, that's really already 30 minutes of film, so I'm not doing that right. That's 30 seconds, because it's actually a half second, a half a day. I said it wrong. There you go. I'm confusing everyone. You get about a half a second in a half a day, a full second a day. So 60 days is a minute. So for 360 days, if you worked every day for 10 straight hours, you'd have a 60-minute film. That's how hard it is to animate alone. And the only person I know that ever used to animate alone quite like that was Stan Brakhage. And I know Harry Smith animated alone, but he had all the construction that he needed from the constructivists that worked for him. Now, Gulliver's Travels, we have the Fleischers with a big studio animating, and they get this movie out before the one I'm not going to share with you, which is Snow White, the Seven Dwarfs, which is actually a better movie than Gulliver's Travels in a way, because it follows cinematic rules in animating realistic situations, although they're completely fantastic, which is what the rotoscope was going for in this film. The rotoscope in Gulliver's Travels was to make something look realistic amidst all the fantasy. The music is constructed well in both Snow White and Gulliver's Travels, but I think what's nice about Gulliver's Travels is doesn't really take itself too seriously. Like, it's kind of ham-bone philosophy, like we're here to make fun of a story. Now, we all know But the original book by Jonathan Swift is a lot more complicated and goes through a lot more than just the Lilliputians and the war between them, because there's actually 5 countries in the Jonathan Swift that go to war with each other, and they are all trying to manipulate the guy whose giants come to them, but some of them are even bigger than him. Some of them, the land of giants in Gulliver's Travels is a total reality, and then he's one of the small ones in the land of giants, but then he goes back to Lilliput, and he's totally huge again. I mean, it's like this, instead of Alice in Wonderland where she bites a mushroom and then turns big, he's like sitting here, I go to the land of giants, I'm small. I go to the land of Lilliputians, I'm big. I don't seem to fit into this strange world out here. But the cartoon version, all the regular versions, and all the other cartoon versions focus on the Lilliputians is cool, but that there's a lot of other interesting things that happen in Gulliver's Travels, like him going to look for treasure in Shiznit. And Shiznit, while he's going to look for other items that he wants to take back to home to prove that these people are real and that he doesn't have a camera, because cameras weren't invented when Gulliver went on his travels, which is kind of ironic because he goes to sci-fi lands. And there are a few automatons in the book, but that's just the way it goes for that kind of literature. And that's English literature, but it's from the early 1900s, late 1800s popularity. And this is in the 30s. Color film, sound film. But I do want to talk about Disney for a minute because they're my heroes, and I got a whole stack of Disney here. This is a really interesting one because it's Black Cauldron, and if you look around on the picture, you can see everybody. And this is one of my favorite Disney films because now Disney, we remember, started out with Alice cartoons in the early 20s. They were silent films, and he made some of them with some early animating buddies like Pat Sullivan and Rabbi Works. But that they were kind of ahead of him in the game didn't mean he didn't catch up. And I'm showing the Alice case because he directed these Alice cartoons that were in the early silent era. And what you got to remember about the Alice cartoons is they were used very little animation. They took a long time to make, like all cartoons did, as I explained earlier. And they eventually metamorphosed into the Mickey cartoons. And the Mickey cartoons started coming out with, like, Plain Crazy in 1925 was one of the best ones. And then you get Steamboat Willie, which is already a sound cartoon. So I'm not saying anything against Snow White when I say Gulliver's Travels and Prince Ahmad came first, but what I'm saying is it was the breakthrough one that showed the draftsmanship down to a precision. And all those animators they'd hired and those help they'd gotten from CalArts and the help they'd gotten from Disney building CalArts later on, and even earlier than that when they built an animation studio and hired all those animation actors, and they had to go through some things to get it to work. But out of all that came towards the 1950s, a movie like Alice in Wonderland. But long after Disney's legacy was gone, which is never, because Disney's legacy is still there, and it's like he's alive, and they keep him alive under the Pirates of the Caribbean ride, as we all know. But the Black Cauldron, he's frozen in ices and cryogenics. Now, this is a really, really excellent movie, and that little guy right down here, that's Gurgi. Now, I didn't really like it to see Gurgi get into trouble like he did in the movie, but that a special Black Cauldron sacrifice was made, we can all allow it. That this story was a Lloyd Alexander story, and he's an amazing fantasy storyteller. And that they took that and turned this into one of those realistic kind of cartoons, but it is a fantasy. And so, what's really pleasurable about this is it goes through kind of that Adventures of Dungeons and Dragons feel, where you're kind of going through these different levels, gaining experience, and then you have to fight the unsurpassable odds, the survivable. And then you get to save the girl, you save Gurgi, you save your dad, you save Hinwin. You know, everybody lives usually. There's fairies floating around in this. I mean, it's beautiful. The animation has some computer effects in it, although it was the Great Mouse Detective with the Big Ben clock in the background that really used the computer animation, like Aladdin. Another one that Prince Ahmad reflects on is when you see the giant tower slash down the side of the room, and like in this kind of way Aladdin dodges it by going where the window would be just barely, and it's like Buster Keaton dodging his house or something that goes right over him and rolls off the edge. And then with Black Cauldron, you get this big skeleton battle like you do in The Evil Dead. I mean, like, that's one thing that's controversial about some of Disney. They'll kind of push the edge a little bit. They kind of had this skeleton army and some other demonic-looking creatures in the film, and I don't really mind that. That was what I liked about it as a kid anyway, was that there was a skeleton army in it. And one thing that's different about Alice in Wonderland as a film is there's really no identifiable antagonist other than the Red Queen of Hearts that really is the antagonist of this film, and the conflicts are absurdism. It's like she can't find the path because the dog sweeper's sweeping off the path, you know. The direct conflict isn't identifiable in one character. It's the curiosity and the not being able to figure out what Wonderland's all about that keeps her on this adventure. Because it's not necessarily, like, in the book she has to slay the Jabberwocky, and there is good versus evil. But that the Black Cauldron is a good versus evil, hands down, good to the max, evil to the max, we're going to see it all. But in Alice in Wonderland, it's like the true evil is how absurdism, the Salvador Daliism has gotten. Like the clocks are all melting, and now we can't tell time, and now we're a little frustrated. Because if the clocks weren't melting, and by the way, she does drink a potion that says, drink me, and gets small. But she eats a little candy that says, eat me, and she gets big. Now let's just relate this to another story that we've talked about in the first semester of MASTERCLASS, and that's Celine and Julie Go Boating. That movie by Jacques Rivette from the French New Wave in the 70s. Now, is it just me, or does Celine and Julie always sit down in front of, like, this idea that there's going to be a screen in front of them and you never see it, but when they sit down to do it, they're laughing and talking to each other and kind of getting kind of sweet with each other, and then they take the candy, and then suddenly they see themselves in this, like, but it's not Wonderland, it's like this frustrating world where there's no identifiable real antagonist except somehow nurses are getting killed in this weird home, you know, and then they're in a total daytime soap opera all of a sudden, and they're walking around, and it's like, okay, they sat down and they ate the magic candy. But in this one, it doesn't just make her see and hear stuff, because she's already seen white rabbits run by before she's had any shrooms or any of her chocolate candy or any of her drink. And there's other things that shrink her and grow her too. I mean, you could, in the book, you can do it just by, like, imagining yourself bigger and you get bigger. I mean, I'm sure it's not quite that plain. There's always got to be some objective, like take the elixir, get stronger, you know. And I understand that. But in Alice in Wonderland, it just breaks out with absurdism over absurdism. Like, you get the Cheshire Cat disappearing and reappearing, and, you know, he's got that great standing on his head. You got and then the Mad Hatter's Tea Party. Now, and I only brought Celine and Julie up because it seemed intertextual that they were taking candy and it would transform them into a different plane. And that they were playing in the soap opera while they were watching it was all triggered because of the magic edibles or whatever. And this may be true in two senses, but that Alex doesn't really have an out-of-body experience, nor like she's more like Gulliver in Gulliver's Travels. That she's observing the characteristics of the world around her is what really makes for the interesting story. And so the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, now we go to another reference, and that's Jan Schrunkmeyer. Jan Schrunkmeyer does this Alice story called Alice, which is an Alice in Wonderland story that really didn't happen a lot in cinema, or doesn't, because Disney goes to such expensive lengths to buy the rights and pay for these big movies that they can't afford these rights to these books being linked out. But then now we're in today's age when the rights are all owned by different people. Like, the original scripts are all owned by the Writers Guild, and you know, most of them, and then the scripts that aren't owned by the Writers Guild are old scripts, which can all be accessed because we have permission, unless we don't get it from the author. But if we have permission from the author to look at it, like, I could get permission to retype Lewis Carroll if I wanted to, but I don't want to because that's too sacred for me. It's too much into another field that I'd have to get into to retype any Lewis Carroll and even quote him. But I'd have to go get permission to do that, or quote one of the scripts you know. So there is a Tom Petty video too that, just to tell you guys, it's called "Don't Come Around Here No More" or something, and it's like kind of bad grammar, but it's funny because it's Tom Petty, and we always excuse him that. But anyways, he does this video, or like the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, where the Mad Hatter, he is Tom Petty, and he's got like this huge hat on him, and you always remember the expressionisticness of this video that was on MTV one time, and he's like sitting there, "Don't come around here no more," and they're all sitting around the table, and he's got, you know, the offshoot hat, the big hat. So I bring that up because at the Mad Hatter's Tea Party, which I gotta say, we gotta cut off class short today. In a minute, we're gonna talk about 2 more films and then burn back another class in a minute. But because it looks like we were having some mild difficulties keeping this going past 30 minutes, so we're gonna make this first opener short. We're gonna come back with another 30-minute segment later today, and then we're gonna teach the class. But what I need to tell you about Alice in Wonderland that's really important is that in the Jan Schwenkmeyer version, when he did get the rights to use the film in the 80s, he did this like really industrial version of it where he's moving these like utensils around, and these like scissors around, and these like rulers, and he's got like these pencils, and Alice gets lost in a drawer of like pencils and rulers and sharp compasses, and she's like, dives into a drawer, warps into another world, looks around, it's all weird. Dives into a drawer, looks around, goes in and goes in. So now she's doing both her usual looking around and observing, and she's warping like Celine and Julie. So it's just a little trance on how Alice has had the perspectives from all the POVs within and without her head looking at her, as though we can switch modes and look between these 3 examples. And there's the Mad Hatter Tea Party in this, they're always looking for a clean cup, like they're in the Schwenkmeyer version, right? They have 2 sips, they tell a crazy story, and then they clean cup, move down. And that's cool because that's actually straight out of the Lewis Carroll book, and all of these things are, and you can even say that the things they're references to Alice in Wonderland are, of course, references to Lewis Carroll, that he wrote the book like a mathematical puzzle, is because his math teachers were stumping him, so he'd make them into these weird fantasy characters in his book. That he knew a young lady named Alice is true, and that it was a friend of his, and he wrote about her is true. And that nothing really surpasses any version of it, although I'm choosing the Disney because, I mean, it's got some magic to it that just the way it's avant-garde in a commercial way is so absurd to be purely avant-garde and purely commercial at the same time. The last one I want to talk about is one last Disney film, because we have a few more animated films to go through, but we're going to come back and do that in the second half later. For now, I want to tell you about Fantasia, and what I think is great about Fantasia, and what I love about it is you got to understand that Walt Disney, after Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, he made Bambi, Dumbo, Pinocchio, Fantasia, and one other one, and I'm not thinking of it right now, but he made them all at the same time. And they were right there at the end of right after Snow White, just one after another of these beautiful movies they'd been working on forever. And that Fantasia came out in 1940 is because it was one of the last ones they were working on, but it was one of the first ones they started on. And that famous experimental animator from Germany, Oskar Fischinger, came out of the woodwork and directed some movies like Optical Poem, where the images matched up to the movie, and in all of the ones we've seen, the images match up to the movie, and the movie matches up to the images. And we ask, do they animate it first and then use the sound, or do they use the sound and animate it first? And we usually find out that they animate it, use the sound, and then use the sound and animate it. They do both. Which one they start on is arbitrary to how the script looks, and how, whether it's a sound at the beginning of the film or it's an animated sequence at the beginning, and usually it's both. And so, strangely enough, usually both work on that at the same time. And if they correlate at the same time, then they're all already following kind of a, an elliptical narrative, because they're asking themselves to bend themselves to the motion of the music. And the motion of the music is always going forward and forward action, like we can feel the woodwinds shoving past us. And it's interesting because even in Black Cauldron, which is a more modern style of animation, you get this feeling that the wind is blowing through them and they're carrying on, because they're actually linear, but that they move to a pattern of music, and that the pattern of music is adjusted to move to them, is absolutely true. And in Fantasia, even more so, because to the music video point of matching up the images with the music, no matter what we cut to, although the images do last long enough to absorb them completely, and that there are people that actually go through and archive these movies. They archive these movies and they meticulously retouch the animation. And by retouching, I mean they completely upgrade the way the picture looks to maximize it so it looks like the original film picture that came out. And all the ones we saw today, except the Animatrix, were actually originally on film stock, even Black Cauldron. These movies we saw today in Alice in Wonderland is such an upgrade of the film, but it's how it looked when it came out. And that's like beautiful splendor, because we know Technicolor was already an ideal form for cinema history. And we also know Snow White was a big part in getting Technicolor across, because Snow White was 1 year before The Wizard of Oz, which really puts perspectives on things if you think about it. But then you look at Fantasia and you see this artwork, you see these designs, you see these characters, and then you imagine that these all move to everything from Nutcracker Suite to Night on Bald Mountain to Hail Mary at the end, and to A Sorcerer's Apprentice. I mean, you get the Greek mythology, you get the crocodiles and the hippos throwing each other around, everything. I feel like when you see the devil in this movie, it's like Walt himself being the devil. And I feel when you see Mickey and Mickey as the apprentice and the sorcerer he works for is Walt, but Mickey's like a real entity at this point, and he's like, well, I'm not going to let Walt down, and then Walt has to clean up the set, but there's something that's always been seen about that in Mickey himself, about how he kind of saves the day, even though in a weird way he caused so much destruction. Because think about it, if it was going to happen, it's a good thing it happened to him, because he wouldn't have just left the room like the sorcerer or somebody else would have done, while those guys torched water all over that well until they filled the whole place up with flood. But if it wouldn't have happened to Mickey, then maybe his sorcerer wouldn't have been alerted. I don't know. Maybe I'm reading too much into that. I'm supposed to dragnet the subtextual meaning of all these things. And really, when the sound matches the image, you really have to meticulously be animating, because not only are you drawing, you're drawing for the next half-second sound waves in 3 hours. So it takes 3 hours for a half-second, let's say. Let's bunch it down. And you're moving just enough. It's 24 frames per second, so you're moving about every 3 frames are the same image, and then the next 3 frames are a slight movement that would be timed as an eighth of a second later, right, or something around there. So then you're timing the music, and it's like, well, it jumps up here in an eighth of a second, so we've got to animate a little more bombastically to the shape of the music. I'm not kidding you, that's what they really do for hours and hours and hours. And with the computer, you're just taking the picture after you draw it on the computer, so really it takes just as long, if not longer, depending on how long your computer takes to draft a picture out of it. So, I mean, if you can imagine all those movies, Pinocchio, Dumbo, Bambi, Fantasia, all those movies coming out, there's no Snow White and Seven Dwarfs all at the same time. You just imagine what it was like going to the theaters in 1939 and 1940 with not just Stagecoach and all those movies out, but Stagecoach, Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind. But now you've got all these Disney movies to go see, and it was the golden age of all cinema. It was the perfect time to go to a movie. And it all kind of capped off with Fantasia and how experimental it was to do these pieces of music with these like set pieces that were choreographed just for the music, and were stories from the music and stories from animators that they had, and that there were these concept pieces. That the whole movie is a concept piece with classical music is wild, but these cartoons were concept pieces for the memory of the music, and I give all those films 4 stars. We'll be back. I'll show you a little preview here. We'll be back in a couple of hours, and we'll be talking about some more animated films that I'd like to talk about in a serious way. And there's really only a few more, so I'd go for it now, but we're having quite a little stunt in computer memory, and we just got a new computer, so give us a few minutes, and we'll be back with the second half. All right, thank you. Thank you for joining Masterclass today, and we'll see you in the second round.